A Hell's Angels member discovers a dying waitress. What happened next shocked the entire restaurant. The rumble started low, a guttural growl that vibrated through the sleepy streets of Cedar Creek. It was past midnight, and most of the town was deep in slumber, but the sound of a custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycle was impossible to ignore. It swelled, then softened, as the rider downshifted, pulling into the dimly lit parking lot of Pete's Diner. The chrome gleamed under the solitary flickering fluorescent light, reflecting the worn asphalt and the faded paint of the diner's sign. Frank, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, dismounted with an almost predatory grace. His heavy leather vest, emblazoned with the infamous Hell's Angels patch on the back, stretched taut across his broad shoulders. Beneath it, a dark t-shirt offered glimpses of intricate, faded tattoos that snaked up his arms, disappearing under the sleeves. His jeans were worn, faded in all the right places, and his boots were scuffed, testament to countless miles and untold stories. He wasn't a young man, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, his face a roadmap of hard living, a grizzled beard, a stern jawline, and eyes that held a depth of experience most people could only imagine. They were sharp, observant, missing nothing. He pushed open the diner door, the bell above chiming a weak, rusty protest. The air inside was thick with the lingering scent of stale coffee, fried onions, and a faint, cloying sweetness from forgotten pies. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on the worn red vinyl booths and chipped formica countertops. Only a handful of patrons remained at this late hour, an elderly couple hunched over a single slice of cheesecake, 2 truckers nursing mugs of black coffee, and a lone figure in a booth near the window, lost in the glow of his phone. Every head in the diner turned as Frank entered. The conversations, already hushed, died completely. The clinking of cutlery against ceramic plates ceased. A palpable tension, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, filled the space. Frank seemed oblivious to the sudden silence, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His gaze swept across the room, taking everything in with a quick, efficient scan. He walked with a deliberate, unhurried stride, the slight jingle of keys and metal on his belt the only sound in the sudden quiet. He chose a booth in the furthest corner, away from the windows, offering him a full view of the room. He slid into the worn seat, the springs groaning slightly under his weight, and settled back, his posture relaxed yet ready, like a coiled spring. A young woman, the sole waitress on duty, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her name was Sarah. She couldn't have been much older than 22 or 23, but the dark circles under her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders, and the faint pallor of her skin added years to her appearance. Her blonde hair, pulled back in a hurried ponytail, had escaped in wisps around her face. Her uniform, a light blue dress with a white apron, was clean but clearly well worn. She had been working since early morning, covering a double shift, and the exhaustion was etched onto every line of her face. She saw Frank, and her eyes widened almost imperceptibly with a flicker of apprehension. She swallowed hard, then forced a small, tired smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" Her voice was soft, a little shaky. Frank met her gaze for a split second, his expression unreadable. "Coffee. Black." His voice was a low rumble, surprisingly calm, devoid of any aggression. Sarah nodded, turning quickly to fetch a mug. Her movements were a little slow, a little clumsy. She bumped her hip against the counter as she poured the coffee, a soft oof escaping her lips. Frank watched her, his eyes following her every move, not with scrutiny, but with a quiet, almost detached observation. She returned to his table, placing the steaming mug down with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "Anything else?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the table, avoiding his eyes. "That's all for now," Frank replied, picking up the mug. He took a slow sip, his eyes still on her. He noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool diner air, the way she swayed almost imperceptibly as she stood. He noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she retrieved the pot from another table. He noticed the way she pressed her hand to her side for a moment, a fleeting gesture of discomfort. Sarah retreated to the safety of the counter, busying herself with refilling sugar caddies and wiping down surfaces that were already clean. The other patrons slowly resumed their hushed conversations, casting furtive glances Frank's way. the elderly couple whispered behind their hands. The truckers exchanged knowing looks. The man on his phone pretended to be engrossed in his screen but stole glances over the top of it. Frank ignored them all, focusing instead on his coffee, the steam curling around his face. But his senses were still alert, still processing the subtle cues from the young waitress. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The diner slowly emptied out. The elderly couple paid and left, their goodbyes to Sarah tinged with concern. The truckers, after a final refill, rumbled out into the night. Only Frank and the man with the phone remained, along with Pete, the cook, who was now visible through the kitchen service window, wiping down the grill with methodical slowness. Sarah moved around the nearly empty diner, her movements growing visibly slower, more deliberate. She picked up stray napkins, straightened chairs, her body language radiating profound exhaustion. She passed Frank's booth, heading towards a table near the back where a family had left a small mess. As she reached for a crumpled napkin, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table, her breath catching in her throat. Her knuckles, gripping the table's edge, were white. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to regain her equilibrium, a faint groan escaping her lips. Frank, who had been watching her from the corner of his eye, stiffened. His hand, which had been resting on the table, subtly clenched into a fist. He didn't move, but his focus intensified. Sarah pushed herself upright, taking a deep, shaky breath. She forced herself to continue, moving towards another table, attempting to clear the last remnants of the dinner rush. Her face was now alarmingly pale, her lips a faint bluish tint. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the room as if she were struggling to make sense of her surroundings. A thin sheen of cold sweat now glistened on her forehead and upper lip. She reached for a stack of dirty plates left on the table. Her hand trembled violently, and her grip was weak. The top plate slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly to the tiled floor, shattering into several pieces. The sudden noise, amplified in the quiet diner, made everyone jump. Pete, the cook, peered out from the kitchen, a look of annoyance on his face, quickly replaced by concern as he saw Sarah's distress. The man at the window booth finally looked up from his phone, a frown creasing his brow. Sarah stared at the broken plate, her chest heaving slightly. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from the broken dish, but from a deeper, more profound weariness that seemed to overwhelm her. She bent down slowly, cautiously, to pick up the larger shards, her movements incredibly unsteady. As she reached for a piece, her body swayed violently. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes rolled back in her head. Before anyone else could react, before the man on his phone could even register what was happening, Frank was out of his booth. It wasn't a hurried scramble or a clumsy lurch, but a fluid, almost silent motion. One moment he was seated, the next he was across the diner floor, covering the distance to Sarah in 2 long strides. He moved with an astonishing speed and a strange, almost surprising grace for a man of his size. He reached Sarah just as her knees buckled completely. His powerful arm snaked around her waist, supporting her weight before she could collapse to the hard, unforgiving floor. Her body went limp in his grasp, a dead weight. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. The entire diner froze. Pete, the cook, dropped his spatula with a clang. The man in the window booth gasped, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. The air crackled with a sudden, electrifying tension, a mixture of shock, fear, and utter disbelief. The Hell's Angels member, the intimidating figure who had silenced the room with his mere presence, was now holding the unconscious waitress in his arms. Frank gently lowered Sarah to the floor, his movements surprisingly tender and precise. He didn't just drop her, he knelt beside her, carefully positioning her head, checking her airway. His large, tattooed hands moved with a practiced efficiency that seemed entirely out of place for a man of his outward demeanor. He ripped open a few buttons on her uniform dress, loosening the collar around her neck. He placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for a pulse, his brow furrowed with intense concentration. "Call 911. Frank's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a low, gravelly command that cut through the stunned air like a knife. It wasn't a shout, but it carried an undeniable authority, a raw urgency that demanded immediate action. Now! She's barely breathing. The man in the window booth fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. He looked from Frank to Sarah, then back to Frank, a look of profound confusion and fear mixing on his face. Pete, the cook, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror and bewilderment. Frank ignored them both, his attention entirely focused on the young woman lying lifelessly at his feet. He tilted her head back, lifting her chin to open her airway, then leaned down, placing his ear near her mouth and nose. He watched her chest, searching desperately for any sign of movement. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, was now etched with a grim determination. "She's fading," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice losing some of its earlier command, replaced by a note of genuine concern. He straightened up slightly, glancing around. "Did anyone call?" he demanded again, his eyes briefly flashing towards the man with the phone. "Why yes. I'm calling," the man stammered, holding up his phone, his finger hovering over the screen. He was clearly intimidated, not just by Frank's presence, but by the sudden, terrifying emergency unfolding before him. Frank didn't wait. He moved swiftly, placing the heel of one hand on Sarah's sternum, placing his other hand on top, interlacing his fingers. His posture was textbook, his elbows locked. He began chest compressions, rhythmic and forceful, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. His face was set, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on Sarah's pale face. The sound of his grunts, the slight thud of his hands against her chest, filled the silent diner. It was a stark, brutal sound, a desperate rhythm against the backdrop of a dying night. The sight was utterly surreal. A Hells Angels member, typically associated with violence and intimidation, was performing CPR on a young, unconscious waitress in the middle of a deserted diner. The man on the phone, now actually speaking to the emergency operator, kept glancing at Frank, his voice hushed and disbelieving as he relayed the situation. Pete, the cook, finally snapped out of his stupor, rushing out from the kitchen, a phone in his hand, though he seemed unsure what to do with it. He just stood there, gaping, watching Frank's relentless, desperate efforts. Frank continued the compressions, his muscles straining, a thin sheen of sweat now appearing on his own forehead. He paused, checked her breathing again, then resumed, his eyes scanning her face for any flicker of response. He was talking to her now, a low, guttural murmur. "Come on, kid. Don't you dare give up on me. Fight it." His voice, though rough, held a surprising tenderness, a pleading quality that was utterly at odds with his fearsome appearance. He leaned in closer, attempting to deliver rescue breaths, pinching her nose, tilting her head, his lips pressed against hers. The intimacy of the act, given the circumstances and the people involved, was profoundly unsettling and deeply moving. He took a deep breath, exhaled into her mouth, then repeated the compressions. The distant wail of sirens began to grow louder, piercing the quiet night, drawing closer with every agonizing second. The red and blue lights began to flash through the diner's front windows, painting the interior with an urgent, pulsating glow. Frank didn't stop, didn't even look up. He continued his desperate efforts, his focus absolute, his determination unwavering. The approaching ambulance was a promise of professional help, but for now, it was just him, a Hells Angels member, fighting for the life of a dying waitress in a diner that had suddenly become a stage for an unexpected drama. The doors burst open as the first paramedics rushed in, their voices urgent, their medical bags clutched in their hands, their eyes immediately falling upon the shocking scene before them. Frank, still on the floor, still performing compressions, looked up only briefly as they arrived, his face grim, his breathing heavy, but his eyes still burning with an intense, unyielding resolve. He didn't relinquish his position immediately, continuing for a few more beats, as if unwilling to let go of the responsibility he had so unexpectedly taken upon himself, until one of the paramedics gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling for him to step aside. Frank finally relented, slowly moving back, his gaze never leaving Sarah's pale, still form as the paramedics swiftly took over, their movements quick and practiced, attaching leads, checking vitals, barking orders to each other. The diner, once a quiet, almost forgotten space, was now a whirlwind of activity, a crucible of life and death, all centered around the young woman and the unlikely savior who had refused to let her slip away unnoticed. The paramedics moved with a practiced urgency, a whirlwind of motion around Sarah's still form. One knelt at her head, checking her airway, while another cut away her uniform dress, revealing pale skin beneath. Wires were quickly attached, monitors beeping to life, displaying erratic vital signs. And drip was started, the clear fluid flowing into her arm. Frank, still breathing heavily, watched their every move, his eyes fixed on Sarah. He had stepped back as commanded, but his posture remained coiled, ready to spring back into action if needed. The tension in the diner, which had momentarily dispersed with the arrival of professional help, now shifted, settling into a different kind of unease. The wail of sirens culminated in a final, screeching halt outside. 2 Cedar Creek police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their emergency lights painting the diner's interior with alternating red and blue flashes. 2 officers entered, their hands resting on their holsters, their gazes sweeping the room. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, landed almost immediately on Frank, his Hell's Angels patch a stark beacon in the chaotic scene. The air thickened with a new, unspoken suspicion. "What do we have here?" one of the officers, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, asked, his voice cutting through the medical jargon. He was Detective Miller, known for his tough exterior and even tougher questions. His eyes narrowed as they lingered on Frank. A paramedic, a young woman with a calm, efficient presence, quickly briefed him. Unconscious female, approximately early 20s. Cardiac arrest, possibly due to severe exhaustion and underlying issues. Bystander-initiated CPR, kept her going until we arrived. Good compressions, saved her life. She nodded towards Frank, a flicker of professional respect in her eyes. Miller's gaze snapped back to Frank, a mixture of surprise and skepticism warring on his face. He approached Frank slowly, his hand moving subtly to his side. "Sir, can you tell me what happened?" His tone was clipped, formal. Frank met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "She collapsed. I helped." His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. He offered no further details, no elaborate explanations. Miller's eyes traveled from Frank's face to his Hell's Angels vest, then back again. The contrast between the man's fearsome appearance and the paramedic's report was jarring. "You're a Hell's Angel, aren't you?" It wasn't a question, but an accusation. "That's my club," Frank confirmed, his voice flat. Before Miller could press further, the paramedics began to move Sarah. She was carefully transferred onto a stretcher, her face still alarmingly pale, her breathing shallow but now supported by an oxygen mask. As they wheeled her towards the door, Frank took a step forward, a guttural sound escaping his throat. "Which hospital?" he asked, his voice rough with an unfamiliar urgency. The female paramedic, without breaking stride, glanced back. "Cedar Creek General. Emergency trauma." Frank nodded, a silent acknowledgement. He wanted to follow, to ensure she was truly safe, but the police presence and the clear boundary of the medical emergency held him back. He watched as Sarah was loaded into the ambulance, the doors closing with a definitive thud. The sirens flared to life once more, fading into the distance as the ambulance sped away. The diner, now eerily quiet after the departure of Sarah and the ambulance, was still a scene of investigation. Pete, the cook, was being questioned by the second officer, his face a mixture of fear and bewilderment. The man from the window booth, still shaky, was also giving his account, his voice hushed and disbelieving as he recounted Frank's actions. Miller returned to Frank, his posture less aggressive now, but still wary. "We need a full statement from you, sir. Your name? Any relation to the victim?" "Frank, just Frank," he replied. "No relation. I was a customer. She was working. She collapsed, I gave her CPR. I know CPR from my time in the service." He offered the last detail almost as an afterthought, a clipped explanation for his unexpected skill. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. "The service? Military?" Frank merely nodded, his gaze distant, as if recalling a past he rarely revisited. And you just happened to be here, late at night, in a diner, when a young woman collapsed? Miller pressed, his suspicion still evident, trying to find a hole in Frank's straightforward narrative. That's right, Frank confirmed, his voice unwavering. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't yielding either. He simply stated the facts as he saw them. The broken plate still lay on the floor, a stark reminder of the moment Sarah had lost consciousness. Frank's eyes swept over it, then across the now empty diner booths. The lingering scent of stale coffee and fried food seemed heavier, imbued with the residue of anxiety and fear. He felt an odd hollowness in his chest, a peculiar blend of adrenaline crash and something akin to a lingering concern he hadn't anticipated. Miller continued his questioning, circling around Frank's presence, his identity, trying to probe for any hidden agenda. Frank answered each query with the same stoic directness, never elaborating, never offering more than what was asked. The officer seemed frustrated, unable to reconcile the intimidating biker with the life-saving actions witnessed by multiple people. Eventually, Miller stepped away, conferring with his partner. Frank watched them, then slowly rose from the booth. He walked to the counter, pulling out a wad of bills from his worn leather wallet. He placed a $50 bill on the counter, far more than the cost of his untouched coffee. For the damage, he muttered to Pete, who was still looking utterly stunned. And for Sarah. Pete could only gape, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He managed a weak, "Thank you, sir." Frank didn't wait for more. He walked out of Pete's diner, the bell chiming its rusty protest behind him. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. The police cruisers were still there, their lights flashing, but the ambulance was long gone. He climbed onto his Harley, the custom-built machine rumbling to life with a deep, familiar growl. He didn't head home. He pointed the bike in the direction of Cedar Creek General Hospital, the name a silent mantra in his mind. The hospital waiting room was a sterile, unwelcoming place, a stark contrast to the grimy comfort of the diner. Frank's leather vest and heavy boots seemed entirely out of place amidst the muted tones and hushed whispers. Other visitors, mostly families with worried faces, gave him a wide berth, their glances a mix of fear and curiosity. He found a seat in a far corner, his broad shoulders filling the plastic chair, and waited. A nurse at the reception desk eyed him warily. After an hour, Frank approached her. "I'm here about Sarah. The waitress from Pete's diner." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, shook her head. "I can't give out patient information, sir. It's hospital policy." "I saved her life," Frank stated, his voice calm but firm, holding her gaze. "I need to know if she's going to make it." The nurse hesitated, her professional demeanor clashing with the raw authority in his voice. She checked her computer, then looked back at him, her expression softening slightly. "She's stable, for now. Critical condition, but stable. Dr. Evans is with her. She's receiving treatment." Frank nodded, a subtle tension easing from his shoulders. Can I see her?" "No, sir. Not yet. She's in intensive care. No visitors right now." The nurse's voice was gentle but resolute. "You can wait in the waiting room if you like. We'll inform you of any significant changes, but it could be a long night." A long night. Frank returned to his corner, the fluorescent lights of the hospital casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. He leaned back, his eyes closed for a moment, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to him. He was a Hell's Angel, a man of the road, of loyalty to his club, of a life often lived on the fringes. Yet, here he was, waiting for news of a young waitress he'd never met before tonight, a woman whose life he had unexpectedly held in his hands. Hours crawled by. The waiting room slowly emptied, then filled again with new faces as morning approached. The first faint light of dawn began to filter through the hospital windows, painting the sky in hues of gray and rose. Frank remained, a silent, imposing figure, his presence a stark anomaly in the sterile environment. Finally, a doctor emerged, a woman with kind but weary eyes, her lab coat crisp. "Dr. Evans." She scanned the waiting room, her gaze falling on Frank. She had been briefed by the paramedics about the bystander who saved her life. She approached him cautiously. "Mr. Frank?" she asked, her voice soft but professional. He stood, towering over her. "How is she, doctor?" Dr. Evans sighed, a small, tired sound. "Sarah is stable. Your actions, Mr. Frank, were nothing short of heroic. You gave her a fighting chance. When the paramedics arrived, she was in cardiac arrest. Without your immediate CPR, she wouldn't have made it." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "She's suffering from severe dehydration, extreme exhaustion, and malnutrition. It appears she has an underlying cardiac condition that was severely exacerbated by the stress and lack of proper care. Her body simply gave out." Frank listened, his face a mask, but his grip on the chair tightened imperceptibly. "Will she be okay?" "It's going to be a long road to recovery," Dr. Evans admitted. "She's young and strong, but her body has been pushed to its absolute limits. She'll need extensive rest, proper nutrition, and follow-up care for her heart condition. We're doing everything we can." Frank nodded slowly, processing the information. The doctor's words painted a grim picture, yet also offered a glimmer of hope. He looked towards the door that led to the intensive care unit, a silent promise forming in his mind. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. The story of Sarah, the dying waitress, and Frank, the Hell's Angel, was far from over. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek General Hospital hummed on, casting a cold, unwavering glow as the hours bled into days. Frank remained in the waiting room, a silent sentinel whose very presence was a stark contrast to the sterile environment. He didn't leave, not even for a moment, subsisting on vending machine coffee and the occasional sandwich brought by a sympathetic, albeit wary, nurse. His Hell's Angel's vest was a magnet for stares, but he met each glance with an unreadable stoicism that deterred any direct confrontation. 2 days after the incident, a harried-looking woman and a younger man, both with the same tired eyes as Sarah, burst into the waiting room. They were Sarah's mother, Martha, and her younger brother, Tom. News of Sarah's collapse had reached them in their small town 2 hours away, and they had driven through the night. Martha, her face streaked with tears, approached the reception desk. Frank watched, his senses alert, knowing this was Sarah's family. Dr. Evans emerged shortly after, guiding Martha and Tom into a private consultation room. When they reappeared, Martha's face was even paler, but there was a flicker of resolve in her eyes. She saw Frank, still seated in his corner, and hesitated. Dr. Evans, noticing, spoke to her quietly, gesturing towards Frank. Martha's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and profound gratitude washing over her face. She walked towards him, her steps faltering slightly. You're Frank?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The doctor said, you saved my Sarah." Frank nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "She's a fighter." Martha reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she grasped his large, tattooed forearm. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling up again. "Thank you. We didn't know what happened. She never told us how bad it was." It was then that Sarah's story began to unravel. Her father had passed away suddenly a year ago, leaving the family with medical debts and a struggling farm. Sarah, the eldest, had quit college to work, sending most of her meager earnings home. She had been working 2, sometimes 3, jobs, barely sleeping, barely eating, trying to keep her family afloat. The diner double shift was just one more desperate attempt to cover a looming bill. Her body, already weakened by an undiagnosed congenital heart defect, had simply given out under the relentless strain. Detective Miller reappeared at the hospital, his presence a stark reminder of the ongoing police investigation. He found Frank still in the waiting room and approached him, his expression less openly hostile than before, but still cautious. "Mr. Frank," Miller began, "we've completed our initial interviews. Pete, the diner owner, and the other customer corroborated your account. They're calling you a hero." He paused, a strange mix of grudging respect and lingering suspicion in his voice. "I also ran your name. Frank Miller, correct?" Frank grunted. "Just Frank." "Your service record came up," Miller continued, ignoring the correction. "Sergeant Frank Miller, U.S. Army, combat medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Purple Heart recipient. Highly decorated. He looked at Frank, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. That explains the CPR skills. Frank offered no comment, his gaze fixed on a distant point. He rarely spoke of his military past, a chapter of his life he had closed off, choosing the brotherhood of the Hells Angels over the structured, often traumatic, world of the armed forces. But the skills learned, the instincts honed in life-or-death situations, remained. So, you just happened to be in Cedar Creek that night? Miller pressed, still trying to find a motive beyond simple altruism. Passing through, Frank replied, his voice a low rumble. Needed coffee. Miller sighed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He knew he wouldn't get more. The evidence, the witness accounts, and now Frank's record, all pointed to a straightforward act of heroism. There was no foul play, no hidden agenda. Just a man who had seen someone in distress and acted. All right, Mr. Miller, Miller said, a slight emphasis on the full name, a gesture of respect. We'll need a formal statement when Sarah is able to give one, but for now, you're free to go. Thank you for your cooperation and, for what you did. Frank simply nodded, watching the detective leave. He wasn't looking for thanks or recognition. He was waiting for Sarah to wake up. Days later, Dr. Evans finally granted Frank permission to see Sarah. He walked into her intensive care room, the sterile beeping of monitors the only sound. Sarah lay pale against the white sheets, tubes, and wires connecting her to machines. Her eyes were open, unfocused, but she was awake. Her mother, Martha, sat by her bedside, holding her hand. Sarah, honey, Martha whispered, this is Frank. The man who saved you. Sarah's eyes, still hazy with medication and weakness, slowly turned to Frank. She recognized the broad shoulders, the grizzled beard, the intense gaze. A flicker of memory, fragmented and dreamlike, passed through her mind, a strong arm, a deep voice, the rhythmic thud against her chest. A tear traced a path down her temple. Thank you, she mouthed, her voice a barely audible whisper. Frank simply stood, a towering figure by her bed, his usual gruff demeanor softened by an almost imperceptible tenderness. Get some rest, kid, he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. You got a long fight ahead. And so began Sarah's long road to recovery and Frank's unexpected, unwavering commitment to it. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant. He learned Sarah's story from Martha and Tom, the weight of her family's struggles resonating with a part of him that understood hardship and loyalty. He discreetly consulted Dr. Evans about Sarah's cardiac condition, learning about the specialists she would need, the medications, the long-term care. One afternoon, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade, polished to a mirror sheen, pulled into the hospital parking lot. 2 men, built like brick walls and wearing matching leather vests, entered the waiting room. They were members of Frank's Hells Angels chapter, sent by the club president after news of Frank's extended absence and the unlikely circumstances had reached them. They found Frank in his usual corner. Frankie, one of them, a man named Duke, grunted, his voice a low growl. What in hell are you doing, brother? Frank met their gaze, his expression unchanging. Doing what needed to be done. Duke and his companion, Hammer, exchanged a look. The club heard, Duke continued, his voice softer now. A Hells Angel, saving a waitress. Good press, Frankie. Unexpected. He paused. Anything you need? Trouble with the badges? Frank shook his head. No trouble. She needs help. Her family's broke. Medical bills are going to bury them. Duke nodded slowly. The Hells Angels, despite their fearsome reputation, had an unspoken code of loyalty and, sometimes, an unexpected sense of justice. Frank was one of their own, and if he had taken this young woman under his wing, there was a reason. We'll see what we can do, Duke said, a subtle understanding passing between them. For a brother. True to their word, within days, an anonymous donation to the hospital foundation was made, specifically earmarked for Sarah's medical expenses. The amount was substantial, enough to cover her critical care and the initial stages of her specialized treatment. Frank never mentioned it, but Martha and Dr. Evans were informed, a mystery benefactor suddenly easing an unimaginable burden. As Sarah slowly regained strength, Frank began to speak to her more. Not about himself, but about her future. He encouraged her, in his own gruff way, to rest, to eat, to focus on her health. He learned of her dreams of going back to college, of becoming a teacher. He listened, a silent observer, but an active supporter. The story of the Hell's Angel and the dying waitress spread like wildfire through Cedar Creek and beyond. Local news picked it up, initially with skepticism, then with a growing sense of awe. The diner, Pete's Diner, became a local landmark, with people stopping by to see where the miracle happened. Pete, initially bewildered, found himself telling the story again and again, his annoyance replaced by a quiet pride. The broken plate, once a symbol of Sarah's collapse, was now a treasured, albeit broken, relic, carefully preserved behind the counter. Detective Miller, despite his initial reservations, found himself defending Frank's character in interviews, stating unequivocally that Frank's actions were purely heroic. The town, once wary of the Hell's Angels, began to see Frank not as a symbol of fear, but as a man who had shown profound, unexpected compassion. Weeks turned into months. Sarah was discharged from the hospital, still weak, but on the path to recovery. Frank was there to see her off, a quiet presence in the background. Her family, overwhelmed with gratitude, insisted he come to their farm for a meal. He accepted, a rare softening of his stern demeanor. At the farm, a small, weathered house surrounded by fields, Frank sat at their humble kitchen table. Martha cooked a simple but hearty meal, and Tom, no longer as shy, spoke excitedly about Sarah's progress. Sarah, still frail but with a growing light in her eyes, looked at Frank. "I don't know how I can ever repay you, Frank," she said, her voice stronger now. Frank looked at her, then around the small, warm kitchen. "You already have, kid," he rumbled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Just get better. Go back to school. Live your life." He knew his time in Cedar Creek was drawing to a close. His unexpected detour had served its purpose. He had seen Sarah through the worst, ensured her future was secure, and perhaps, in a way he didn't fully understand, found a measure of peace himself. The experience had chipped away at the hardened exterior he had built around himself, revealing a deeper humanity that even he rarely acknowledged. The next morning, Frank was gone. His Harley-Davidson was no longer in the hospital parking lot or outside Sarah's farm. He had ridden out of Cedar Creek as silently as he had arrived, leaving behind a changed town, a grateful family, and a young woman given a second chance at life. Sarah did go back to school. With the medical bills handled and her health slowly returning, she enrolled in community college, pursuing her dream of becoming a teacher. She carried a small, faded photograph in her wallet, a grainy newspaper clipping of Frank, his Hell's Angels vest prominent, standing by the ambulance after her rescue. It was a constant reminder not just of the man who saved her, but of the unpredictable kindness that could emerge from the most unlikely places. Pete's Diner continued to thrive, a testament to the unexpected drama that had unfolded within its walls. The story of the Hell's Angel and the waitress became a local legend, a tale told and retold, about how a moment of crisis could reveal the best in humanity, even in the most hardened of souls. Frank, the Hell's Angel, continued his life on the road, a solitary figure on his custom-built Harley. He rode through countless towns, under endless skies, but the memory of Cedar Creek, of Sarah, and of the night he had fought for a stranger's life, stayed with him. It was a quiet reminder that even in a world full of shadows, there were moments when light broke through, when a simple act of courage could forge an unbreakable connection, shocking an entire restaurant and changing lives forever. The rumble of his engine was his constant companion, but now, sometimes, he heard a faint echo of a young woman's whispered, "Thank you," in the wind, a testament to the fact that even the toughest exteriors could hide the most profound depths of human compassion. He was still a Hell's Angel, still Frank, but he was also the man who had knelt on a diner floor, fighting for a life he almost let slip away, forever bound by the unexpected grace of that miraculous night.